human brain function comes up because of this. The internet works the way it does because of this. Our society is able to build airports, shopping malls, and even manufacture a humble pencil as a result of this phenomena. I'm talking about networks. This effect pervades so much of what we see, and yet we notice it so little. The way in which something completely different emerges from the underlying individual components, which are so different, might be the single most common design element of all of creation. I can't think of many other fundamental concepts that are more important for us to understand in order for us to build our Dyson Sphere. Our guest, Baruch Barzel, is an exceptional scientific storyteller and a very prominent expert in network dynamics. He is an assistant professor at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and he was a very sought-after network scientist who studied quarantining strategies to control the spread of COVID-19. When researching Baruch, I came across this film called iPencil, which I do recommend. And that film started with a quote from G.K. Chesterton that went, quote, "The world will never starve for want of wonders, but it will starve for want of wonder."
Back light. Okay, engine stop. 413 is in. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Hey Baruch, I've been looking forward to this conversation for so long. I'm very excited.
Thanks.
I wanted to start to talk about this quote from Carl Sagan. So he said, when you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you have to invent the whole universe. And I think a lot of people describe the same sentiment in different words. And I was listening to this lecture from you, and you were going on this thought exploration about buying a cup of coffee and how the money moves. Could you walk us through that?
Oh, right. So, yeah, it's way more basic than an apple pie, right? It's a cup of coffee. But you buy a cup of coffee and you pay, say, I don't know, let's go for Starbucks. You pay like $4 for a latte. And now we can ask ourselves, okay, so where does this $4 actually go? And of course, some share of it has to go to the owner of the coffee shop, but then a share has to also go to the barista who's making the coffee for me. Maybe there's a waiter or waitress around. But if we really look into this, then some of the money, some of the dividends from these $4 has to be spread along the carpenter that built the bar and the chairs, and the truck driver, she drove it from the port to the coffee shop. And then, we need also the shipping company, and eventually we get all the way down to the people who are picking the coffee beans in Ecuador or wherever that happens. And I think it's reasonable to say that my $4 for a cup of coffee were somehow spread. The people had to cut a dividend from those $4. It had to trickle down to maybe 100,000, maybe in some estimates even 1 million people. And the point is now to reverse the picture. Because the reverse of that picture means that if 1 million people got a share from my $4, it means that 1 million people participated in the labor to create this cup of coffee. And we can do this with anything that we do in our social systems, any product that we buy, any activity that we do, and anything that we ever do in the social setting is a result of a cooperation of hundreds of thousands or millions of people, none of whom have any idea that they're cooperating, none of whom care about my cup of coffee, but somehow there's an emergence, right? The system creates a cup of coffee. So a cup of coffee is like a phenotype, and the genotype is a black box of how society operates. Now, we've set a very high bar because people now expect that by the end of the podcast, they will understand how coffee is produced through the shared cooperation labor of millions of people. And the truth is that this remains a riddle even by the end of this podcast, but we might go one step towards understanding how these things occur.
That's really beautiful, because for me, it made me think ever since I heard you say that. So every moment that I take in my life, like even when I would walk down a street, so it's like sort of a collapse of a network with every moment. A lot of things have happened for me to experience that moment, and then it's suddenly so overwhelming, and it becomes a very rich and very overwhelming sense of experience. Because if like a bird poops on your head, it's like so many things have happened for you to experience the bird poop on your head, right?
To me, but okay.
So I want to dig a bit deeper into complexity. So a piece of a stone is just a smaller stone, and it's not the same for a car. So you have an engine, you have a clutch, you have brakes, and you have a steering wheel, and all of these little parts interact with each other, and then something interesting happens. And I know from reading about your papers and hearing your lectures that all of the magic happens in the interaction between these components, and same things doesn't happen for stone. So what's actually going on? What is complexity?
Right. So I think you nailed it with this metaphor. We're going to use this metaphor as we go down. So a car is comprised of like 10,000 or 20,000 different components, but none of these components is a small car. None of these components can steer the wheels or charge a battery or ignite the gas pump or whatever. Nobody knows how cars works, right? But never mind. Whatever happens there is some miracle that happens, right? So every time you drive your car, there's actually a cooperation between 10,000 components that together lead to the emergence of the phenomena we call car, which we can understand, right? You press this button, that happens, you press this pedal, and that happens, and so on. But it's a cooperation of many, many, much more simple components. So when simple components come together to create a whole new set of phenomena, we call this complexity. You have simple building blocks that create together complex behavior. And complex is in the eye of the beholder, because someone might say that the simple building blocks are just as complex as the car. So when I say complex behavior, I mean a behavior that cannot be trivially traced to the simple components. It's very trivial to see how 10,000 pebbles form a big rock. It's not trivial to see how 10,000 components of your car form something which is completely new, different, and novel as compared to its intrinsic components. But here's the crucial point. We don't find cars very surprising, because cars were engineered. These components were geared to cooperate with one another and lead to the phenomena of a car. There's a blueprint, and we can trace it. Again, it might be more complicated than what me and you can handle, but there is someone out there, an engineer, that knows exactly why this gear cooperates with that other gear. But nature is full of systems that seem to have the same idea of simple building blocks coming together to provide complex behavior, where there is no central design, and there is no engineer, and there is no blueprint. We mentioned one of these examples where we talked about how society produces cups of coffee, right? Society is comprised of 7 billion individuals. And I'm not saying that individuals are simple building blocks. Each one is a world on their own, but they are very different from society. And it's not trivial to extrapolate from the behavior of an individual who just wants to make a living to phenomena that occur at the societal level. We can buy cups of coffee whenever we want. But it's not just about society. We take 20,000 genes and put them together. We don't get a big gene. We get a cell, which is a whole different system with different functions that cannot be easily traced to just mapping the list of genes of the system. We take 100 billion neurons and put them together. This is the average size of a human brain. Maybe our listeners have a bit of more neurons in their brain, I'm not sure, but we take 100 billion neurons and put them together, we get a brain, and a brain is not a big neuron. None of the neurons can feel or take in sensory input or apply motor skills and so on. The brain somehow does that. So these are very big questions, and they are at the heart of what we call complexity. Simple building blocks come together to lead to the emergence of very complex behavior.
Okay, so I want to ask you, the person who has thought about these things at some length, and I, sitting here, think about these things and make these little examples in my head, and I think that I am thinking very deeply about them. So it's good to ask an expert about it. So when you look at a car, as you said, there is this intention from an engineer to actually build a car. So I want to transport a person or stuff from point A to point B. I need it to be this big so that it can contain people, so on and so forth. But if you look at something like, as you said, a neuron colony, like a brain, or if you were to look at a bee colony, do you think that there exists an a priori intention, some sort of blueprint out there which expects for these sort of features to emerge? Or do you think that it just coincidentally happened to be there?
So between these two extremes, I think there's a middle ground. So the intention is a very, this is how we personify nature, right? We always think that there's an intention, that there's a goal, because that's how we decide on our actions. And, when we look at nature, and this is really way beyond my area of research, I think the main wonder when we look at nature is how everything seems to tick together, right? And it seems like there has to be some blueprint to how these things behave. Now, without taking any stance on whether we believe that or we don't believe that, I will take stance on one thing. It is not very scientifically effective to go from that direction. I mean, part of what science has done is to be able to find simple mechanistic rules, reductionism in a sense, that are able to lead to many of the emergent phenomena that we see that seem to be planned. And from a scientific perspective, this is, it's much more efficient and much more effective to study these systems from that point of view. Because once you introduce an external designer, well, I mean, then your work is done, right? And you don't gain everything that science has helped us gain. So I'm not taking a stance on, which one of these approaches is more correct. I do have my own opinions there, but it's not a matter of more correct. It's a matter of what are your motivations? What are you looking for? In my head as a scientist, I'm looking for a mechanistic understanding. I'm not looking for an external design.
Okay, good. So the reason why I ask you that is because I want to sort of turn the question on its head. Is it possible for us to sort of have an intention, but not explicitly engineer the parts? So let's say I want to build a car, but I'm too lazy to build all the parts. Can I build a system which has all these simple bits and pieces where I sort of hope that it will develop itself? It can, how do I say this? The point of me going from point A to point B will just be a consequence of me building elementary parts, and I just don't know how it's going to work, but somehow we're going to end up there. Is it possible for me to engineer such a system?
You mean like the internet? This is a very profound question, actually. I mean, one of the things that we can gain by understanding this is that now we can apply this. Now, I'm not an applied physicist or a mathematician. I mean, I'm an applied mathematician, but when mathematics is applied, it's still very theoretical. So I deal with the theory of these things. But one of the things that, and a lot of modern technology is actually based on that, is the idea that, sometimes you can get very rich, complex phenomena, like cups of coffee, without engineering every single component. So a car, it belongs to a realm of technology where everything is thought through and every single component is geared to the precise shape and function that it needs. But things that build on crowdsourcing, for example, or things that build on internet search like Google are kind of emergent phenomena. Google or Amazon or a lot of our modern technologies, they really just create some incentives. They create some rules of the game. But then they kind of count on millions of agents to provide the data without any agent actually wanting to help Google. None of us care about Google's profit margin. We just want to search things on the internet. So there's a simple incentive that causes a certain behavior that when you look at it at the societal level, eventually it provides Google with so much information that they can offer a product that is not engineered like a car is engineered. So I think a lot of our modern technology is at least inspired by this way of thought, to say that we have a complete understanding of this, to say that we can create ant colonies. Okay, no ant cares about the colony. An ant colony is like Google, right? An ant just wants to follow a simple set of rules. It doesn't know anything about the colony, about the loyalty to the queen, about the ideology of why their colony is better than the wasp colony on the other side of the road. They don't care about all that, right? But somehow the colony emerges from that. Some of our modern technology is going there. And a lot of modern human phenomena are already there, even though we're not aware of it. But to say that we have, a level of control and a level of polish, as nature has polished ant colonies over millions of years of evolution, no, we're not there yet. But a lot of people are talking about this, swarms of robots that have simple rules, but together they can somehow do something. Cooperative phenomena.
I'm always quite happy whenever I'm driving a car and I know that I'm going to be 5 minutes delayed because I see this red streak on my Google Maps. And I know that it's because there are people out there stuck in the traffic jam who are using Google also, and they are sort of transmitting data saying that they're stuck in the traffic jam. Like, yes, I'm so glad that it's crowdsourced. And I never really thought about this actually being an emergent phenomenon. If we all sort of turned off our Google Maps, like Google Maps is going to be a pretty crappy product. And it's actually a very good example of complex engineering, I think, right? Yeah.
In fact, even before we had Waze or Google Maps, traffic jams are an emergent phenomenon, right? Every driver has a simple set of incentives, very simple rules. You keep distance from the car in front of you. You don't care about the car in back of you. Very simple set of rules. And when you just apply these rules in a computer simulation, you can get the emergence of a lot of traffic phenomena that we see, like the emergence of traffic jams, the release of traffic jams, and so on.
Just in the case of traffic jams, you don't really want traffic jams to happen. So you're not really engineering for the traffic jam.
Yeah, it's an undesired transition. Agreed.
Yeah. Cool. Good. Okay, so let me get to the heart of your expertise, I think. So can you get us through the nuts and bolts of what makes a network?
Right. So the first thing is, and now that we've appreciated complexity and emergent phenomena, the first question is, where does the miracle happen? And now we need to start abstracting this. So the first thing, and we kind of mentioned this, but we didn't say it explicitly, is that a brain is not just 100 billion neurons, just like a cell is not just 20,000 genes, just like society is not just 7 billion individuals. A brain is 100 billion neurons that are connected through a network of links in which one neuron can activate or impact or transmit energy to another neuron. And so behind every complex network, and this is the paradigm, this is what you need to believe if you want to join my lab, for example, is that behind every complex system, there's an underlying network that maps the interactions between the different components. If you want to understand complexity, you need to start by understanding these networks. And this is not my novelty. This has been going on for roughly 20 years with the emergence of a science called network science. And there are a few, I would say, profound discoveries about the structure of these networks that we see across the board. That is in brains, in ecological systems, in social systems, in technological systems. And maybe we'll just go on, maybe two of them that I think are specifically interesting.
Sure.
Right. So the first one, I said this is a 20-year-old science, but for the first one, I want to go back 50 years. Let's go back to the 60s. It's 50 years, 50-something. Okay. The first one goes back to the 60s, and it's an experiment that has been done many times since, but I think the most interesting one is the original version that was the first to try to systematically map the pathways in these networks. So we don't have online social networks back then. We don't have any information about the genetic interactions in the cell back then. But we do have the US mail. And here's how it works. So one day, a farmer in Omaha, Nebraska, opens his mailbox and he sees a letter from Harvard. And he's very happy. He thinks, okay, they're finally appreciating my talents. Maybe they're offering me a fellowship or something like that. But of course, that's not the case. He opens the envelope and he discovers that it was actually addressed to the wrong person. And here's what the letter actually said. My name is Professor Milgram. I work at Harvard in Boston. And this letter is not for you. It's actually for my colleague, who is very close to me. And here are some details about this colleague. His age, what he does, the kind of research he does, and where does he spend his time. Now, if you know this person, then you can just forward this mail to him. But if you don't, then try to scratch your head and see who might actually know this person. And you can think of another professor or maybe someone who lives in Boston. Think whatever you can, right? And try to forward the letter to them. So it's a chain mail. And today it would go directly to my spam folder, right? But, back in the 60s, people were a bit more loyal and it was from Harvard. And people were, a bit more disciplined. So they did what they were told. And that wasn't the only letter. 300 such letters went around and started roaming around the United States. Not all of them reached their destinations, but the ones that did, the percentage of letters that actually made it all the way to the end, had a very interesting information about them because they actually recorded the pathways that connect between two completely random people a farmer in Kansas and Nebraska, those were the destinations, and a professor in Boston, as geographically and socially distant as you can imagine in the 1960s society of the United States, which at the time had something like 250 million people. So what were the lengths of these paths? How many handshakes or how many stamps does it take to link two random people in a society of hundreds of millions? And the answer came as a big surprise to many. You know the answer, right?
Yeah.
6.
I do. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we all know about the 6 degrees of separation. The myth says that any two people in the world can be linked within 6 handshakes. The reality is that on average, 2 people in the US, from the letters that actually arrived in Boston and so on. So we put a lot of caveats on this argument, but this experiment has been recovered in much more rigorous terms on digital networks since, and we see it all the time. You have networks with millions or even hundreds of millions of components, nodes, but the pathways that link between them are extremely short, orders of magnitude shorter than what you would expect if you look at particle systems of the same size. Now, you would think that there's maybe something in the social system that leads to that. Maybe people connect in ways that optimize for very, very short network paths. But the disappointing thing is that this has nothing to do with human beings or with any inclination of social networks. Proteins, thousands of proteins that are connected by chemical interactions are just 4 or 5 chemical interactions away on average from each other. Billions of neurons are just 3-4 hops away from each other. Websites in the internet, components in the power system, animals in an ecological network, they are all way closer than you would think given the size of the system. And in fact, we have networks ranging from hundreds of nodes, like in ecological systems, all the way down to billions of nodes, like in society or the internet. And the average pathway between the components ranges somewhere between 2 and 10. So this is called the small world phenomena. We all know this. It's became something of a cultural fad, and it's not unique at all to social networks. And today we have a complete understanding of the math behind it. How deep do we want to go here? You tell me.
Okay, well, I mean, I already have a few questions that I want to ask you from whatever you've said, and then let's go a bit deeper into the math. So, so you said, okay, so for me, what is very counterintuitive here is from the 1960s, if I look at the postal chain, it would be very difficult for me to find people who are going to bring the letter into the correct destination. But now, obviously, like my network size is much bigger, so I have many more friends, I have more access to people, and I would imagine that the number of people that I need to contact in order to get to the person who I want to talk to is going to be much smaller. But apparently it's not the case, right? So you're saying that it's going to be 6 back then, and it's not that much better now.
Okay, let's put a cap on that. I mean, there's nothing sacred about the number 6. Neither did Milgram say that the number is 6. He just said that the average path of the letters that reached their destination was around 6. There's nothing sacred about that number, but the point is that the number is a single-digit number for a society with a 9-digit population. That is the crucial point. So if the number is down to 4, like people claim it is on Twitter, or maybe 7 or 8, like in other social networks, that's fine. The point is that it's orders of magnitude smaller than the expected size, given that's the magnitude of the system. That is the crucial point. 6 is definitely not a sacred number. The second point you mentioned is actually very, very important. I don't know if Milgram noticed that, but what this experiment really discovered is not just that people are way closer than you think to one another, it's that they're able to find these pathways. Mm-hmm. I mean, there might be even shorter pathways. People are not optimizing here. All you know is local knowledge. I mean, I don't know who are my friends' if I knew they were my friends, right? So all I can ask myself is who within my contact circle might bring me closer to the destination. And it could have been possible that the pathways are extremely short, but there's just no way to find them. And that has to do with the fact that society is not completely random, and people have a hunch who might know a professor in Boston. They might send it to someone who's geographically closer or professionally closer or within the same age group. So there is structure in the social network. It's not a completely random. If it was a completely random map of connections, there would be no way to find these short paths. There has to be some structure to allow that.
I like to understand systems by parameterizing them. So I want to maybe go a bit more into maybe the mathematics or the nature of these systems. What parameters affect the number of people? Keeping it simple. So if I want to go from one person to another person, 6 degrees of separation, if I want to decrease that to, let's say, 2, what are the parameters that I need to change? Or vice versa, if I want to increase it to 100, how can we change that?
So for this, we need to understand the mathematics behind the small world phenomena. And we're using social networks because it's a very intuitive grounds on which to build our intuition. But again, it's true for almost any network you can think of. And let's start with a very, very simple model. Imagine that all I put is you at the center of the world. Then you have 10 friends. Okay, maybe you have more, but for the sake of this example, you have 10 friends. Each one of them has 10 friends. So within 2 steps, you already have 100 friends. And each one of them has 10 friends. So within 3 steps, you've already reached 1,000 friends. You can see where this is going. Within k steps, you can reach a number of people which is 10 to the power k. So the more mathematically inclined people see, oh my God, this is an exponential inflation, it's going to blow up right away, which is true. So if there are, let's say, roughly 10 billion people in the world, if we just keep this way of thought, 10 billion people means you just need like 10 steps, right? It's 10 zeros, right?
Right.
9 zeros. No, it's 10 zeros. Yeah, so you just need 10 steps to reach 10 billion people with just having 10 friends per person. Now, of course, I'm cheating here. I mean, I'm oversimplifying because some of your friends' friends are also friends with each other. I kind of assumed a tree with no loops and with no, other fine structural characteristics. So this is a very, very crude and simplified mathematical derivation, but it's as good as we can do in the context of a podcast. So let's remain with that because it's not that wrong. It's roughly okay to go with this math. And what we get is the following thing, which is very interesting. In classic particle systems, you have things organized in a very well-structured lattice. There might be some noise, some discrepancies, but roughly speaking, it's a lattice. Think about people sitting in a classroom with rows and columns, so it's like a 2-dimensional lattice. If you want to pass a message from one end of the room to the other end of the room, you have to cross all the people in the middle. Because in the lattice, there are no shortcuts. But networks are not like lattices, they are like a tree. And the way a tree branches leads to this exponential growth. So within 2 steps, you can reach 100 people, 3 steps, 1,000 people, and you can reach many, many people, an exponentially growing number of people within a very, very short path. So it has to do with the random structure. A lattice is very well structured. And because it's very well structured, it doesn't have these shortcuts. In a random system, you have all these shortcuts. You have this person who moved from Boston to San Francisco in Southern California. The whole social network of California becomes way closer to the East Coast. And it's the randomness that actually leads to that. And most of these systems, you don't need a lot of randomness, are random enough to behave like these exponentially growing trees. So the first answer to your question is, what would you do? If you had 10 neighbors per each node, you would get 10 to the power something. If you had 20 neighbors per each node, you would get 20 to the power something. The world would become even smaller. Second thing, what would you do? Make it as random as you can. The more random, the more shortcuts you get. The more structured, the more you become like a particle system in the lattice, and then you don't have shortcuts. So randomness and density are 2 key factors that lead to the small world phenomena. And I have a hunch that your next question is going to lead me to the 3rd key factor. So I'll let you ask it.
Okay, I'm gonna take one small step back just to make an observation, and I think this is very interesting about networks. And when I was thinking about having you on, suddenly everything that I looked like a network. There was something related to it.
I know. You can't unsee networks.
Exactly.
Once you start, it's a problem.
And what I notice now, talking to you, is that networks need not be spatial. It's very easy to observe spatial networks, like how you describe a lattice, and it's very cute that social networks are not necessarily spatial, especially now that we can communicate with people who are very far away. You can sort of compress spatial distance using just one link between two nodes who are really far away, and I think that's quite that's quite cute.
Precisely. We have to give credit to Watts and Strogatz, who I think were the first to kind of notice this phenomena in 1998. And that is the fact that, if I look at a social network, roughly speaking, it should be a lattice, right? Most of my friends live around me. And the most in your day-to-day contacts are certainly within your geographical vicinity. Most neurons connect to other neurons that are close to them in the three-dimensional space of the brain. So the first thing is that, yes, networks do not completely violate space. There are rules. The crucial point is that you just need a very small amount of randomness to create this small world phenomenon. Again, It's enough that you have one friend who lives in Holland, or that you relocated from Tel Aviv to Boston for a year and you made friends in Boston, and suddenly, by just one hop, you quench down the whole social network by a factor of 2. Another hop, another factor of 2. Within 10 hops, the system just becomes a small world. So the small world phenomena is exactly that. Networks do have structure. They are roughly like a lattice, but very few shortcuts. A sufficient amount of randomness is enough to make them into a small world.
Right. Okay. So the two things that you said. So you need to have the number of people who are around each person. That's going to be affecting how quickly you can spread information. Number 2 is amount of randomness for the social network case. And the number 3 thing that you are going to tell us, I'm guessing, is it about scale freeness?
Don't spoil. Come on. That was a spoiler what you did right now. So yes, in 1999, this is one of the, I would say, discoveries that, kind of gave birth to this entire science. A young researcher named Albert Laszlo Barabashi and 2 of his postdocs, Reka Albert and Hoon Jeong. We have to give credit to everyone. So Albert Laszlo Barabashi, I'm in personal contact with him. I'm currently visiting him in Boston. I also did my postdoc under his mentorship, so I'm a bit sentimental about this discovery. But that was back in 1999, before I was even starting my scientific career. And they looked at it. They looked at an opportunity to study networks. And the opportunity that was in 1999 is a very simple thing: the internet. The internet started to emerge. It was, on the one hand, large enough so that it's going to be interesting to investigate it. On the other hand, small enough so that someone can say, oh, let's look at the structure of the internet. That would be crazy today. And they started looking at how websites connect to one another. And there was a link. If one website had a hyperlink that sent you to another website. And they asked themselves a different question. The first question, not about the path length. The question that everyone asks themselves today when they think about a network. And that's, how many friends do I have? So they asked, how many friends does the average website have? In network science, or in graph theory, we call this a degree, a number of links that surround a specific component. So we have a node, and the number of links, number of friends that that node has, is that node's degree. They were looking at the degrees, and they were expecting to find, like you find in many physical phenomena, that there's like an average degree, say 10. And then, there's a bit of variability, because after all, this is a random and uncontrolled system, so you expect some noise around this figure. So they looked at the degree distribution, and they were expecting to find a bell curve. A bell curve is centered around the average, and then it has a little bit of standard deviation, some variance on the side. A good analogy to have in mind here is the height distribution. Okay, the average person is, let's say male, let's say European. The average person is about 1.80 meters, 6 feet. Okay, and there's some level of variability. Okay, some people are 1.85 meters, some people are 1.75 meters. There are like these 1 in 1,000 people who are 2 meters tall. You find them playing basketball, and the tallest person in the world is, 250, a bit taller than I am. And he's a very rare person. He's 1 in 7 billion. Okay, but he's not I mean, he's not much taller than me, right? I mean, he's just 70 centimeters taller than I am. We can still sit on the same couch that I have in my living room. So we're at the same scale, basically. What they found is a completely different distribution that belongs to a completely different family of systems. They found that the majority of nodes in their system, remember, they were looking at the World Wide Web, they found that the majority of nodes had a very small number of connections. But then there were nodes that had 10 times the average, 100 times the average, 1,000, or even 10,000 times the average number of connections. And just to put this in perspective, remember the height distribution. Encountering a website, or later on a protein or a gene or a neuron or an individual that has 1,000 times more connection than the average is like meeting a person that is 2 kilometers tall in the street. You would never expect to find anything like that, right? So these systems are called scale-free because they're characterized by the fact that they lack a typical scale. This is a very important thing. So let's unpack what that actually means. What do we mean when we talk about scale? So I'm sitting on a chair right now, and you're sitting on a chair, and our chairs are roughly the same. And in fact, we can go to an auditorium with 1,000 chairs, and everyone is sitting on the same chair. How is that even possible? It's possible because humans have a typical scale. It's captured by the average height. The average human is around 1.80 meters. Even if you're 2 meters tall or 2.5 meters tall, it might be a bit less comfortable, but you can still sit on that same chair because no human is 10 times or 100 times taller than the average. So we say that humans have a typical scale, and it means that everything we produce for humans can be accustomed to that typical scale. But nodes in networks are scale-free. They do not have a typical scale. Remember this 2 kilometer tall person we met in the street? Where is she going to sit in the auditorium? Okay, she's at a completely different scale. It's a different order of magnitude. And that's what happens in networks. They cover all different scales. So there is no such thing as a typical node. The vast majority of nodes are small, and then you have nodes that range through all scales, in principle, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 times more than the average, something that is completely prohibited in the classic bell curve distributions that we usually encounter in physical systems.
Okay, so I'm going to take this again from the lecture that I saw from you. So the way that you can think about scale freeness, if you were to include this person in the calculation of your average, it will sort of blow up your average, your whole average, just because you included this one extra person who's 2 kilometers tall, right, compared to if you were to just take an average, which is just the sort of small height people, right? That's what scale freeness is like.
Right. So one of them, I mean, there are two things that occur in scale freeness. I mean, we're talking about the structural scale free of degree, but scale freeness also appears in other cases. I mean, you can think about, okay, let's imagine that I measure your success by your degree. Like in Twitter, everyone counts how many followers they have. So say I have 1,000 followers. I think I have less, but let's say I have 1,000 followers. I have more followers than 99% of people on Twitter. But still, I feel like I'm very unsuccessful, right? Because there's a person who has 10,000 followers and another person who has 100,000 followers. And I always look to the right and I see people who are not just slightly larger than I am, but dramatically larger than I am. Remember, if you're a very tall person, if you're 2 meters tall, you're in the 1 percentile, you're 1 in 100, you really feel like you're at the top of the world. Everyone you see around you is shorter than you are. And even if you know someone who is a bit taller than you, he's just slightly taller than you because it's a bounded distribution and you're really at the edge of it. But at these distributions, at the scale-free distribution, no matter how big you are, there's always someone bigger, 10 times bigger, orders of magnitude bigger to the right of you. So first of all, it's very frustrating and it's good to know because a lot of us measure success in numbers. And success is one of those things that is distributed scale-free. So no matter how successful you are, there's always someone to your right. Okay? So it's a good thing to know. Kind of calms you down because it's a very frustrating phenomena to live in a scale-free world. The other phenomena is really, we said that there is no typical scale. In human size, the typical scale will be the average height, the average weight. In human social networks, the typical scale would not be the average degree. And that is because the average is really biased towards those very highly connected humans. So you take a sample of 100 humans. In a sample of 100 humans, the most well-connected person is, just a little bit more connected than average. You take a sample of 1,000 humans, and suddenly this very highly connected hub entered your sample, and it pushes the average up. You take a sample of 10,000 humans, and again, you enter this other very rare hub, which again pushes you up. And what you get is that the average grows with the sample size, what we're not used to happening. And it means that for a very large system, like if you look at society, if you look at the brain, the average node is really not a good representative of the typical node.
Right.
A good analogy, by the way, to have in mind, I'll make it very brief just so people, get some intuition about it, is in economics, right? The average salary is not what most people make. It's significantly higher than the typical salary. Most people earn less than the average salary. And the reason is that in this average salary, very rich people who make not slightly more than the average, but 10, 100, or 1,000 times more than the average, they also enter the pool.
That's a very interesting way to think about things, and I think it's very different from how we are used to looking at things. But if you were to, for instance, take a population of people and take a look at their heights, and you're able to sort of get a feeling for what country you're in just by looking at, let's say, the mean, the standard deviation, some of these very intuitive quantities that you can calculate to figure out which country you're in or roughly what sort of distribution you're dealing with. But for such scale-free systems, what sort of characteristic things do you look at? How do you know what you're talking about?
Right, so scale-free systems are really characterized not by average, but rather by heterogeneity. So if you want to do the statistics of a scale-free network, what you would really want to look at is the level of heterogeneity. In fact, what happens in a scale-free network is that if we look at I'm going to get a little bit technical here. If we look at the distribution, okay, if I look at a bell curve distribution, it's really characterized by the average. That is the one most important number. Then you also look at the width of the curve, which is like the variance. But the average is an important characteristic. I cannot describe a bell curve distribution, a normal distribution, or a Poisson distribution without telling you what the average is. It's the central parameter of the distribution. When I look at a scale-free distribution, the average is just not there. It's a parameter, but it's an unimportant parameter. And what is the parameter that's really driving the system, the most important parameter? It's the variance. It's the parameter that determines the heterogeneity. So if I need to characterize a scale-free system, it's characterized by the level of heterogeneity. In statistical terms, it's characterized by the tail, by the far end, what you get at the tail. In a normal distribution, the tail is like these very rare people, these 1 in a billion people. In a scale-free distribution, the tail, okay, look at the wealth distribution. The tail is where a significant fraction of the money lies. Okay, in a network context, the tail is where a significant fraction of the degree of the links of the system are connected to.
Okay, cool. Nice.
Think of it as like social capital, like the number of friends you have, number of followers you have on Twitter. It's like money, right? It's like social capital. So the people at the tail, okay, the people at the tail of the height distribution, there are a negligible amount of centimeters in global scale, right? So the tallest person has 250 centimeters. He doesn't even capture a marginal fraction of the amount of height there is in the world. But the most well-connected people on Twitter, or the most wealthy people in our economical system, they cumulatively hold a meaningful fraction of the total number of followership or the total number of finances in the world. That's
Are we
what
able
you
to?
get.
Okay, so are we able to engineer networks which don't have this scale freeness, or is this something which is inbuilt in all networks and you just can't get rid of it?
So, but small world is something you would, I mean, as I kind of indicated, it's kind of the default, right? It's enough to have a little bit of randomness in your small world. Scale free is not a rule of nature. It's not a rule of nature, and there's no rule that says that every network has to be scale free. It is, however, a very pervasive phenomenon. We see it in many different systems. And what you need is, but you do need some physics to occur there. And no matter how you look at it, almost all the physical mechanisms that lead to this level of inequality are what we call a rich get richer effect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the chances of you acquiring the next follower on Twitter, they increase with the number of followers you already have.
Right.
It's easier to find you. Okay, you have a higher chance of being retweeted and then exposed. So when you have this kind of phenomena, small initial distinctions in the beginning, you just happen to be more popular than I am when we both entered Twitter, might lead to vast differences in the end because your rate of growth is also higher than you. So a rich get richer effect is almost, it's almost always has to be present. Otherwise, it's very hard to get something which is skill-free.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I never thought about it in this way. And of course, if you want to gain more followers on Twitter, it's very frustrating when you're sort of very young. But what you're saying is that it gets better when when you get bigger, right? So it's not that hard, right?
I'm still waiting for it to get better.
I want to talk about network dynamics. Networks are cool, and I think we've spent quite some time describing the structures of networks. But I think your expertise lies in network dynamics. How do you think about network dynamics?
So it all started, my first thought was exactly around this. When I discovered the small world phenomena, you use your imagination and you right away think, wait a second, if everyone is so close to one another, that means that information can spread very efficiently between different components, right? So I cough, the whole world should get a cold, right? Because even though you are in Holland right now and I'm in Boston, we are way closer than we think. And if this gene fluctuates for some reason, I ask a biologist, should it affect that other gene? He would say, no. What's the connection? These are two completely different compartments of the cell. But I ask a network scientist, he would say, okay, but they're just 4 chemical reactions away from one another, so they're way closer than you might think. And from a statistical physics point of view, this describes a very unstable system. In a system where every local disturbance has a global effect, it's a system which is very sensitive, very susceptible, and might undergo transitions all the time. What do we actually see in these systems is something much different. If there's one thing that we can say about these not engineered complex systems, is that they are very, very resilient. They are not at all as sensitive as you would expect from things like the small world phenomena. Okay? On the other hand, every now and then, they do undergo transitions. So here's the point. Here's the point about complex systems. Let's go back to our car analogy.
Sure.
In your car, if even one of the components changes its shape or it's, is missing or gets rusty, your car's not moving. Even if you put the wrong fuel in the fuel tank, you'll need to take your car to the garage. Okay? So your car is very well engineered to perform, but it's very inflexible. It's very non-resilient. Every single component is engineered and geared, and once that is violated, the system just doesn't work. And that's not to say that your car is not a robust thing, right? You drive at 100 miles per hour and you do all these things, and then every weather, it's an amazing feat of technology, but it's very inflexible to microscopic distinctions. On the other hand, in an ant colony or in a social system or even in your genetic system, if someone doesn't come to work today, social system doesn't collapse. If one of the ants is lost or doesn't do exactly what it wants, the ant colony will perform pretty well. And, your cells can keep on performing well even with 20 or 30% reduction in the number of their genes. At any given moment, as we speak, there are thousands of routers that are congested and hundreds of power system components that are malfunctioning, that are failed. But most of the time, nothing happens. The internet functions, society functions, your cells function very well, your brain functions very well. So the one thing about these systems is they're extremely resilient. That's the one thing. The other thing is that every now and then we do see big collapses, a major blackout, major, death of cells. The classic is the collapse of an ecosystem. You move this one critical species and suddenly you get this cascading effect and an avalanche and the entire system responds to it. So what exactly happens? It seems that mapping network structure into its actual functionality is not as trivial as we might think. And here is where my research comes into the picture. What we realized in the lab is that if you really want to translate everything you know about the structure of networks, the scale freeness, the small worldness, into functional behavior, what will it do? How will it behave? How will information spread in the system? You need to add another layer of description. So we were undergoing reduction up to this point, right? We took complex systems like the brain and society, and we said, okay, just abstract them. Draw a bunch of nodes and links on a piece of paper. That can be your brain, that can be an ecosystem, that can be your cell. Once you abstract them into a network, they all look the same. And now we are kind of adding color to the picture. We're saying, okay, wait a second, they're not all the same. Because there's a different interaction mechanism. So when you draw two nodes and the link between them, what does that mean? Does that mean that node A infects node B with a disease? That's one mechanism relevant for social networks. Does that mean that node A chemically binds to node B? That would be relevant for proteins in a cell. Or does that mean that node A activates node B, like neurons in your brain? Those are different mechanisms, and similar structures under these different mechanisms may lead to very, very different types of behaviors.
Okay. So, that's... I want to go back to resilience, and I think I want to ask you first, what would make a system more resilient? I think you gave very nice handles to describe what a network looks like. So you described almost parametrically how you can think about a network. Are there also aspects to resilience which are this way? Are there parameters that you can control or you can observe which makes systems more resilient or less resilient? Maybe we can start by even defining resilience first and then going on to this.
So when we talk about resilience, there are several levels to it. I mean, one thing is that the system is able to retain its functionality even though it is subject to all sorts of external stresses. In a network context, for example, you can think of power components that are gradually failing and increasing loads on all the other components. At some point, the system breaks down and you get a major blackout. In an ecological system, you can think of species extinction. And if one species goes extinct, it's fine. If two species go extinct, it's fine. But at some point, you cross a tipping point and the entire system completely transitions to a new state, typically an undesired state, like a mass extinction or it becomes arid or turbid if it's a lake or something like that. So you apply stress to the system, and in response to this stress, the system may retain its functionality, resilient, or may at some point lose its functionality, non-resilient. That's one aspect. A deeper aspect is talking about the flexibility of the system. Sometimes the system doesn't lose its functionality. It still seems like it's functioning, but it's lost its ability to bounce back. Now, if you kick it hard enough, it's going to collapse to an undesired state, and it won't bounce back. So that's resilience in the classic form of how flexible your system is when stress is applied to it. A flexible system, you can kick it. It's like one of those things that always bounces back at you. And a non-flexible system reaches a state where it seems to be functioning, but it's no longer flexible. A minor fluctuation might cause it to collapse, so it's hidden from you. You don't see it, but you would want to know if your system is at that state. So we tested this and using our idea of saying, okay, let's not just look at networks. Let's also look at networks upon which we apply dynamic mechanisms like power transmission in the power system or predator-prey or mutualism in an ecological network. And then we started in the computer, because we can't do these experiments in real life, of course. We started simulating what happens when you stress a system. Like you remove a node or two nodes or remove some links. So you start harming your system. You start applying stress. And you look for the point of collapse, the point where the system loses its ability to retain functionality. And the truth is that it is all over the place. Sometimes, after you just remove 5 or 10% of the components, you get a collapse. At other times, you can remove 90 or 95% of the components, and then it collapses. Now, I'm just imagining this as a scientist. So, the naive way to look at the stress you put on the system is, what is the fraction of components you removed? Is it 5%, 10%, or 20%? So an ecologist comes to me and say, hey, you're a network scientist, right? I say, yes. He said, okay, I need you. I want to know how much stress my system can sustain before it collapses. I can't give this ecologist the answer, oh, anywhere between 5 and 95%. That's not a good answer. And what it really told us is that just by looking at the number of components, the number of links, or the number of whole nodes that were harmed, you get a very, very bad predictor. And the reason for this very bad predictor is everything we talked about earlier. Remember
right?
how heterogeneous your system is. Not all components have an equal impact on the system. Sometimes their degree matters. If it's a link, it matters which nodes it links. So just by looking at how many components you removed, you don't really learn anything about how much damage you actually did to your system. So how would you approach this in a system which is driven by heterogeneity? It turns out that it has to do with a very peculiar phenomena about networks that we didn't talk about, and here is a good time to introduce it.
Go for it.
Okay, so imagine, Arvind, that you are a node in a network. You can be an animal species in an ecological network, or a protein in a cellular network, or just a person with a light on enjoying the power network, the power grid. Okay? And then there is some malfunction somewhere in the network, some failures of power components somewhere in the network. Someone got a virus. There's something that changed at some other area in the network. How would you ever know about this? I mean, how are you impacted? The fact that now you all of a sudden are sitting in the dark, or the fact that now you all of a sudden are experiencing ecological stress and you might go extinct, that is information that traveled to you from somewhere in the network and impacted you. And the only way that this information can ever reach you is because it impacted one of your network neighbors. All the information that a node has, that you, Arvind, has about the network is invested in your immediate neighborhood. So therefore, the network functionality in many cases, the ability of the network to transmit information from one failure that impacts and propagates through the network to affect all the other nodes, has more to do with your friends than about you. It's about your neighborhood. It's not about you. And this led us to understand that if we really want to parameterize the state of the network, we do not need to look at what a typical node does to the system, but what a typical neighborhood does to the system. Now, most people at this point have lost us, because what is the difference? Why should there be any difference between me as a node in the system and my friends? They're also nodes in the system. Why are they different? It turns out that they're statistically distinct in two ways. The first is one of the paradoxes of network science, and that is the fact that on average, your friends are more connected than you are. So you're less popular than your friends. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, it's because I do scientific podcasts and my friends go out to the pub every day, but that's not the reason. There's actually a mathematical reason for this, and to do this, I need the listeners, I need you to be concentrated for a moment, okay? We're going to do a thought experiment. How do you measure the average degree of a node? Well, you do the following thing. You go to the network, you pick a node at random, and you ask him, Arvind, how many friends do you have? And he says, I have 10 friends. And you put them down. And then you do it to another node, and that's how you measure average. So you pick nodes at random, and you ask them how many friends they have. But how would you measure how many friends your friends have? What is the characteristic of your surrounding neighborhood? I don't just pick nodes at random. I pick a node at random, and then I ask that node, I want to know how many friends your friend has. So I ask that node to point to a friend. Okay? And now let's imagine me and you doing this experiment. I have just one friend. Arvind, you have 100 friends. Okay? Because the network is very heterogeneous, remember. I have one friend, you have 100 friends. What are the chances of me being selected in the first experiment? Well, you pick a node at random. I might be selected, and they ask me how many friends I have, I say 1. You might be selected, they ask you how many friends you have, you say 100. Okay. But in the second experiment, we're not sampling nodes. We're sampling friends of nodes.
Right.
I will very rarely be picked in that experiment, because there's just one other node that will point in my direction and say, oh, Baruch is my friend. But you have 100 times greater chance to be picked in this sampling. Because there are 100 people who are going to be pointing at you and saying, oh, choose Arvind, he's our friend. So when you sample friends, you are biased towards the more well-connected nodes. In other words, remember, our networks are extremely heterogeneous, and this heterogeneity is expressed by the fact that the typical neighborhood within your friends, there is more likely to be a hub than within a random sample of nodes. Because the fact that he's your friend or she's your friend is already an indication that they're well connected.
Right.
So when you sample friends, you do a completely different process. The other thing about friends is that they are less heterogeneous than standard nodes. Because when you look at nodes at random, they come at all scales and sizes. We already talked about that, right? But when you look at a node's neighborhood, then you have 100 friends. Your 100 friends are not are already a pretty big sample of the system. Mm-hmm. All the heterogeneity is already there. Everything is big. So the average neighborhood is much less heterogeneous than the average node. In simple terms, I have one friend, you have 100 friends. But my one friend and your 100 friends were sampled from the same statistical pool. So me and you are very different. Individual nodes are very, very different. Neighborhoods are much more standard.
Right, okay, I see. Okay. So let me paraphrase that just a little bit so that we can have a quick recap. So what you're saying is that instead of, so the difference between an average node and an average neighbor, the way that you think about it is that when you're sampling, and by sampling I mean pointing at things to do sort of count stuff, you're not pointing at the person itself and asking the question, but rather turning the arrow around and seeing what is the chance that you would pick a node given that you are taking a certain pathway. So that's how you would think about how you think about an average neighbor, right? Okay, cool. And you're saying that the average node, so all of the scale freeness and all of the oddities of scale freeness is only peculiar to the node stuff, but not to the neighbor stuff.
Right. Yes, precisely. I will also add that a lot of people might have lost us in the math here, and this is a great place to hop back on. So if you didn't completely understand everything we just talked about, that's fine, because you can understand the next take-home message, and that's the important thing. If I want to know what the state of your system is, the best thing to do is to look at the state of the average neighborhood, not of the average node. Because anything a node grasps about the state of the network is mediated through its neighbors. If I can map the state of the neighbors, I know the state of the system. And here is the trick. Don't just say, I redacted 5% of your nodes. I removed 90% of your links. Look at how that impacted the average neighborhood, how it impacted your friends. And what we find is that then you get a much more predictable answer. So here's a picture. This is a podcast, I know, nothing visual, but I want you to have this picture in mind. We start with a zoo of resilience patterns. A system can collapse anywhere between 5% to 95% node removal or link removal, so we simply can't predict anything. But then we say, what matters is not how many nodes you removed or how many links you removed. What matters is how this affected the typical neighborhood of the system. And suddenly, the entire zoo of unpredictability collapses into one universal curve, which says that this is the right number to predict. A good analogy to have in mind here is the difference between 2 cups of water. Right? You know that there are no 2 identical cups of water in the world. If I look at the state of every single molecule in the cup of water, there's never been in the universe 2 cups of water that were identical. There's so many microscopic parameters. The statistics is just way out there. But still, the behavior of a cup of water is very well predicted by just one number. That is the temperature. Beyond 100 degrees centigrade, it collapses into air, right? It becomes a gas. Below 100 degrees, it collapses into a liquid state. So it has a very critical phase transition at a very precise point. What this means is the following. It doesn't matter what the energy of every single molecule is. It doesn't matter what the path and velocity and location of every single molecule is. What matters is how all this comes down to one single parameter, which is very abstract, which we call temperature. So here's the same thing about networks. What's the temperature of a network? It's roughly speaking the average neighborhood. It doesn't matter if you removed a node or two links or did that or that to the system. What matters is how this affected one number. And that number characterizes the average neighborhood in the system. If you look at that number, you get a very highly predictable phase transition from, say, a functional state to a dysfunctional state.
Very cool. I think you really took us to the heart of what I was trying to and hoping to get at. And I'm, really grateful that I feel like I read like a whole bunch of papers and, and had a feeling for this stuff. And now I actually think that I can think about this much better. And okay, so now I want to shift gear and talk about COVID. I think I saw a lecture of yours, which was dated, I think, 2016 or 18 or something like this. It was like well before COVID. And you were talking about pandemic theories and you were talking about how to deal with pandemics. And when the pandemic did happen, I want to ask you, so which of your theories came true and which of them didn't?
So here I have to give, there are lots of stories here, but let's start with the science and then go to the
Sure.
stories of our specific experience as a lab during COVID-19. Yeah, a classic application of network science is the spread of pandemics. And if I have to give a grade to network science, it did not bad. I mean, when you looked at the current pandemic, a lot of the predictions, not necessarily from my lab, predictions from people who actually do network epidemiology as their main focus, they worked pretty well. We can really predict how things spread globally through air travel as they did. Of course, I think there were also some insights on things we need to improve on. The first is, and that's beyond the science, the distinction between good scientific ideas and the political and societal will to apply them. Not only will, but capacity. I mean, how much can, at least today, governments really handle these situations? I mean, you can come up with very good plans, but most of the time they're not very easy to implement. So that's one thing. I mean, bridging the gap between all the good ideas that occur in the scientific arena and our ability to implement them outside the scientific arena. From a scientific perspective, I think that three things that we knew about them all the time, but they really hit us as gaps in our ability to provide very good predictions are temporality, multi-layeredness, and feedback. And I'll very briefly explain what I mean. Multi-layeredness, I'll start with the middle one, means that we have a very robust system to predict how things spread on a global scale. Why? Because we have very good data on where people fly, and very good models to capture the behavior in terms of epidemic spread of a society, a whole group of people where you have good statistics. But what happens is that epidemics, they spread at multi-scale. First of all, they spread internationally through air travel, but then they spread locally through the internal travel and the internal social ties. There, our data is much more partial, and our ability to predict is already much more difficult. So we need to cover all the layers of the spread: the global, the local, the ultra-local, the in-house spread, and treat this as a multi-layered system. I'm not saying anything that people don't know, but I think it was very highly highlighted during the current pandemic. Second is temporality. Up until now, we talk about a network. So here there's a tie between me and you and a tie between me and my other friends. And you can map the social network upon which, say, the flu or COVID-19 spreads. It's not me and you because we're talking through Zoom, but it's me and my coworkers and the people who I share a subway with and so on. So there's this social network. And it's pretty well predictable because I drive in the subway with roughly the same people every day. Okay, I walk, but other people. Okay? But the point is that it's not just about the fact that there's a connection between two nodes. It's the question is, when did this connection activate? If Bob meets Alice and then Alice meets Jacob, that's one scenario. If Bob meets Jacob and then Jacob meets Alice, it's a different scenario. And the ability to spread things is different. Okay? If I want Bob to spread something to Jacob through Alice, they have to meet in the right sequence. So those are temporal effects of the network that make all the math way more difficult. Once again, a whole field. We are researching this. I think in the current pandemic, the importance of temporality was very strongly highlighted. Last one, feedback. networks are not static, they're also responsive. And once again, in the context of the pandemic, it's very clear. As infections go up, doesn't matter what the government says, people keep a distance. As infections go down or people get tired, they stop keeping a distance. So the dynamic state of the system, exactly what we research in my lab, not structure. The dynamic state of the system, in this case, how rapidly things are spreading in the system, also affects the structure of the system, because then people break ties. It's not the right time to have people over for dinner. It's not the right time to have a birthday in the backyard, and so on. So it's a feedback between the structure of the system and its dynamic behavior. Again, structure we've been researching for 20 years, dynamic behavior, main focus of what my lab researchers, but the feedback between them is a level of complication that, is still quite elusive.
Yeah. You had some ideas, I read even in some news articles, for some less invasive quarantines. So I think it's maybe a bit outdated now to talk about quarantines, because we might be past that.
Nobody wants to hear about that anymore.
Nobody wants to hear about them anymore, right?
But you had some. Need that sometime later on down the road, right? I mean, there will be future outbreaks. It's now clear that this is not a theoretical idea. Okay, we will need them. I agree. They're not completely relevant now. I'll treat that. I'll talk about that in a moment. But first of all, it's an interesting story. So as the pandemic started, it reached Israel at around March 2019. And kids were off school, and we were all under, I don't know if you followed the news, but Israel went into a very strict lockdown compared to other countries. And I personally found myself kind of in the middle of the pot, because they asked me to join the academic committee that advised the government, the Israeli government, on an exit strategy. The academic committee had people from economy and people from social science, and at some point it was clear that when it came to the mathematical aspects and the numerical simulations, that would be kind of my lab. So I gathered the lab together. I have a pretty big lab in Israel. We were 13 people at the time. We had a Zoom talk, and we kind of started brainstorming if we have any ideas. And what we were asking ourselves back then is, how come this virus, the COVID-19 virus, is spreading so violently? I mean, people are really keeping a distance, and it still spreads. Now, if you have symptoms, nobody went near you back in March 2019, okay? Even not today. And certainly if you were hospitalized, if you were coughing, so people were very cautious around symptomatic patients. And of course, the reason COVID-19 was able to spread is because there was roughly a 3 to 5 day window before the onset of symptoms where you were already starting to shed the virus. So people became contagious before they started spreading the virus. We call these the invisible spreaders. Now, how do you avoid invisible spreaders? The answer is you can't. They're invisible, which is why you go to a nationwide quarantine. You just avoid everyone. But the price is enormous. I had 2 kids at home at the time, but I'm talking about people's jobs, I'm talking about the economy, I'm talking about people's livelihood. Clearly, that's not a sustainable way to avoid invisible spreaders. So what we came up with is the following idea. We said, why don't we go for alternating quarantine? What is alternating quarantine? Well, first of all, you split society into 2 cohorts, the blue cohort and the red cohort, based on households. Okay? In week number 1, and then you have them working and quarantining in weekly succession. So in week number 1, the blue guys go to work, red guys are instructed to stay at home. In week number 2, they switch, and you go on until you find that the epidemic is tapering off. What do you gain by that? Well, first of all, it's just a 50% quarantine. The individual experience, you only quarantine for a week at a time. So it's much easier. You gain 50% continuously active economy. You have a factory with 100 workers. You can work it continuously. Just spread your workers into 2 cohorts, 50-50. Okay? So you get a continuously active economy at a 50% capacity. When you talk to economists, you understand that this is much more than 50%, because some people can work from home, plus, it doesn't scale linearly. With half the people, you get much more than what you would get with 0 people. Okay, those are the benefits, but what does it do to the disease? Well, it turns out, and we have done extremely detailed simulation, including in-house infections and the temporal dynamics of how people interact with one another. And no matter how much we challenge this system, It outperformed almost any other option, despite the fact that it allowed for a continuously active economy. And that is for two reasons. The first reason is that you get a dual partition. And again, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but I'll have to use words. So picture this. Imagine that you just have everyone working for a week, everyone staying at home for a week. So you partition time, but you don't partition society. You roughly cut down the infection rate, the well-known R0, by a factor of 1/2, because people are only meeting half of the time. Mm-hmm. Now imagine that everyone works all the time, but you just cut society in half. 50% of the people work, 50% of the people are instructed to stay at home. Unfair, but let's face it, most quarantines were roughly like that. Right? Maybe 70% of the people stayed at home and 30% worked, but they weren't egalitarian, right? Mm-hmm. So in that case, you cut R0 by 1/2 because classrooms are half full, your workspace is half full, buses are half full. Why? Because half of the people are staying at home. So if you cut society in half, you cut R0 in half. This is roughly speaking. If you cut time in half, you cut R0 in half. But here you do a checkerboard. You cut both society in half because there's a red cohort and a blue cohort and they're not interacting with one another. And then each one of them works in weekly succession, 1 week out, 1 week in. So you cut time in half for every one of them. The miracle is you still get 50% active socioeconomic routine, but you cut R0 by a factor of 4.
Right.
And that is dramatic. So that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is unique to COVID-19 and the invisible spreaders. And that is what we call in physics an antiphase. You want to time your quarantine in a way that battles the natural cycles of the disease. So imagine, Arvind, that I went to work on week number 1 because I'm in the blue cohort. I might have gotten exposed to the virus. And within a couple of days, I will enter my most dangerous state when I'm an invisible spreader. This is the time of my maximum danger. That's when I'm dangerous. But here's the point. Within a few days, I will enter quarantine. Mm-hmm. By the end of week number 2, I have either developed symptoms, in which case I'm no longer invisible. I know I'm sick and I have to stay at home. Or I have not developed symptoms, in which case I'm probably healthy. If I didn't develop symptoms within 5 or 6 days, I was not infected. Or maybe I'm asymptomatic, but again, after a week or a week and a half, I'm already good to go anyhow. So this is like a ratchet movement. By week number 3, if I haven't developed symptoms, I'm good to go. So if everyone abides by these rules, within roughly 2 or 3 weeks, you've pruned out all the people who were infected, and you get a predominantly healthy workforce resuming their routine in week number 3 or 4. So it's it uses the natural cycles of COVID-19 and makes sure that you're at home exactly at the time of your peak infection, and you're out when you're exactly at the lowest risk point.
Right.
So it's like a resonance, if you want, with the disease cycle.
That's very elegant. With your impeccable storytelling skills, did you manage to convince any of the politicians to implement this?
So what we experienced once we came up with this idea, we put up, today it was published in Nature Communications, but at the time we put up just a very, very rough draft on the bioarchive just, to get the idea out. And I've never experienced anything like this. What I understand in retrospective, it's what is called a media tsunami. So yes, we were approached by hundreds of newspapers, but that's not the point. But also something like 15 or 16 different government agencies. And my house became a headquarter. I was a school teacher by day because the kids were at home. And then by night, I was doing all these Zoom talks with all sorts of government committees. And the result is this. I would love to have said that, this was implemented at the national level by so many governments. In fact, in Israel, it was implemented. It was decided. That was the result of the committee, and that was the government's decision. But decisions and actions aside. So in practice, I have to say, and I beat myself up for that, there was no government that implemented this as a national policy. In retrospective, now that I look back, it wasn't that bad. Because a lot of governments did implement this partially. For example, Austria went back, and Israel, and I think at some point also France, went back to school in this format. of splitting the kids into two cohorts and having them a week on, a week off. Not the same as having a whole household, because you still meet your parents at home and you can still cross-infect between the cohorts, but it's something. It was at the time where it was believed that classrooms are the main breeding grounds for infection. So doing this in classroom may have actually prevented a lot of infections. It's hard to say, right? Government offices in Israel went back to work in this format, and some very big corporations. And this is one thing I learned. We spoke to many governments because they were the ones that approached us. The places where it worked is when you speak to the stakeholders, not to the politicians. So industry leaders, they wanted to go back to work, and they jumped on our idea. So in Argentina, it was the industry leaders that eventually went to the government and said, we want to go back to work in this format. And in Germany, it was a big corporation named Loise, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, that they read our paper and they talked to us and said, you know what, we want to go back to work in this way. And they did. They went back to work for months in the format of splitting cohorts. So again, it's not like all of Germany did that to mitigate the disease, but if a corporation with 50 or 60,000 workers did that, and therefore 50 or 60,000 workers did not lose their job, and may have also avoided cross-infection at the office, you know what? I can't think of any one of my papers that had this level of impact. So I'm not beating myself up as I was in the beginning. Sometimes you don't know exactly where your impact lies. And we have discovered about many places that have implemented this without contacting. I mean, a lot of them did contact us and wanted us to advise on how to do it exactly and so on, and run simulations to make sure that it really works and so on. But we have discovered in retrospective places that did it. You know, they even mentioned our names at some point, but we didn't know that, right? I mean, you write a paper, you don't really know who reads.
Yeah. Okay, so now shifting gear again, thinking beyond networks and network dynamics, what technology or discovery or piece of scientific research has impressed you the most, do you think, in the recent years?
Generally speaking. I think that what I find to be one of the next phases is actually going back to the origins of physics, and that is talking about physical networks. Up until now, when you said that in the beginning, we thought about networks as completely abstract connections, right? Chemical reactions between proteins. There's no location to where these reactions occur. But a lot of our networks, from our infrastructure networks, but definitely in the brain, are actually physical networks. The links are manifested by physical synapses and neurons. And we used to think that this doesn't matter too much, because it really doesn't matter too much. But when you go to networks like the brain, or like your vascular system, the physicality matters a lot, because they are crowded. Your head is of a limited size, and it has to have 100 billion neurons. And it's really limited on creating connections, because links, they cost money, that is energy and proteins and fats, and they take up space. And it turns out that this leads to completely new network phenomena that we haven't considered before. Once you take into account the fact that things have to be crowded and bunched and somehow fill in a physical space. I think this is an interesting step that my lab is slowly endeavoring into, and my current visit in Boston is completely focused on, together with Laszlo Barabashi and his team. And I think there's plenty of new space for new discoveries there, once you add up these limitations. Yeah, okay.
What piece of advice would you think that you would give to young scientists who are out there on the cusp of, starting to study physics or applied mathematics, or trying to think of the same path that you have taken?
I would never advise to take my path. No, I'm kidding here. I think that, a lot of people, they're sometimes, afraid to ask major questions, to go for where their passion actually lies. And I don't want to give here a carte blanche advice. I mean, people need to be strategic, need to think about their capability. But, if you are already embarking on a scientific career in physics or math, clearly you have the talent and the passion for it. I think that sometimes the difference between what seems like the safe and strategic path and what seems like the bold and passionate and courageous path, the bridge between them is way narrower than you think. It's not. We tend to think about these things as two opposing forces that every academic thinks about. Yeah, go for the sure stuff, the easy papers, so that I get my tenure as fast as possible, or try to change the world. I don't think they're that different from one another.
Okay. I ask this question usually to my guests, and I get, I think, interesting responses. And I'm going to let you interpret the question in any way that you like. I start to see more and more that there is this bifurcation in opinion between people, and I think I value the opinion of scientists a lot because I think you've studied and you see the world through an interesting eye or an educated eye, and you think about things a bit more deeply. And at the moment, in the last decade or 2 decades, there has been an explosion of exponential technology. Do you think it's in the right direction? Do you think that humanity is going to be okay dealing with the consequences of this technology?
I think the story of technology, not in the past generation, but in the past 2,000 years, was always about communication and connecting people. Whether it was roads, or shipping routes, or cellular phones, or the internet. Almost all our technological advances are about connections, because that's the one thing we have that sets us apart, and that is the ability to cooperate, and technology enhances that. A lot of the dangers that we kind of see now that have to do with social polarization and what people call the echo chambers, I mean, I see that they are connected to technology. I see that they sometimes sit on a technological platform, but I think they are much more deeply ingrained in social crisis that the past generation has endured. I'm kind of taking another hat here. This is not my hat as a scientist, but there used to be a world with a very clear narrative. Used to be, I would say since the Renaissance all the way up to the period that we are in, which was around humanistic values. And whether you were a capitalist or a socialist or a communist, you agreed on those basic virtues. And one of the basic virtues of humanistic values was human creation, rational thought, and science, which was kind of not part of the discussion. It was always a consensus. In a world which is today kind of a post-truth and post-humanistic world, we're experiencing, I think, 2 things. One is that these clear foundations that were agreed upon across the board, at least in the world that we lived in, back in the previous century, those clear foundations are no longer agreed upon. So today the discussion is on the mere postulates, right? On the question is, what are your basic assumptions? How do you prove things? What is a rational argument? And that is one cause for polarization. And it sits very well and may be enhanced by our ability to communicate, but I don't think it is a result of our ability to communicate. I think it is a result of this transition in human thought. And like every transition in human thought, it's a crisis. Because if your foundations are taken away, if something that was broadly agreed upon is suddenly taken away, it is always a crisis. What comes out of this crisis can be a better world or a worse world, but when you live inside the phase transition, it's very hard to get clarity because everything is turbulent around you. I think we're inside this phase transition as we speak.
Well, very well put. Baruch, look, I think you are an excellent storyteller, and I think you have innate ability to discuss science to people who don't understand it very well, and I think you get handles of physics that are very intuitive, that you can feel and you can think and you can touch. And I love that in the way in which you communicate science, and it was such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
I enjoyed it so much. Thank you.
That was a conversation with Dr. Baruch Barzel. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd love to hear from you on what you liked and what you think we can improve on. Please feel free to get in touch with me at arvind@dysonsphere.one. That's ARVIND@dysonsphere.one. To look back at all our episodes, you can visit us at podcast.dysonsphere.one. See you soon.